Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Adam Blue, and my title is Education Director here at AVA. It's my pleasure to introduce David Verona, who curated this phenomenal exhibition. And I want to welcome you as said, and to, if you permit me to read for a moment, I'll give you a brief bio. David Verona is a woodcut novel historian, author of Wordless Books, the original graphic novels, and a 2009 Harvey Awards nominee. He is the Dean of the Library and Academic Support Services at Plymouth State University, New Hampshire, and a member of the visiting faculty at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction. He has written and reviewed for various journals, including Print Quarterly and the International Journal of Comic Art, and presented papers at Yale and Columbia on wordless books and our visual culture. And this has been an incredible experience for all of us here at AVA, and it's an amazing show. And so beyond the pleasure of sharing this work with all of you, thank you for being such an amazing person to work with. We appreciate it.
Wow, thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be here tonight, and really, come on really closer. What I thought we'd do is, I'm going to start with the pioneer of the woodcut novel, Franz Mazariel, and then kind of go around to some of the more contemporary artists, and then end up as you came in, and I'll introduce you to Roger Buck's work, and we have his grandson and his wife here as well. So. Please interrupt me if you have questions, and I'll certainly answer some questions at the end. Following this gallery talk, I'm going to go over here. I can sign some books. There's plenty of Dover books available as well, so we'll just kind of treat it pretty informal. So, how many are acquainted with woodcut novels by Lind Ward or Franz Mazariel, besides the obvious? I know everyone at AVA raises. Franz Mazariel is noted as the pioneer of the woodcut novel. The way he started, he was born in Ghent, Belgium. He was a pacifist all of his life, and during the First World War, he went to Geneva, where he worked for some journals. What he was required to do was to create a drawing. Every day, he would get a news item about the events, usually with the war, an event of the war, and then he would do the drawing, and then it would be printed. What he found was that these quick sketches and drawings that he did back then in pen and ink, he started using that same technique in woodcuts, especially with the black and white. This is the first portfolio that started this whole genre. And this is a limited edition of his first portfolio. What's really spectacular about this portfolio is that what he focused on, specifically the horrors of war in this portfolio, he continued throughout his career. He wasn't an artist who limited himself. He did paintings. He illustrated more than hundreds of books. And there's a German writer, Stefan Zweig, who's a literary giant, who had a great quote. And basically what he said was that if we lost all the paintings and all the photographs that portrayed the 20th century, and we were only left with the woodcuts of Franz Mazariel, we could recreate the entire 20th century just from his woodcuts. And that's a remarkable statement to be made. So here, if we come close, I'm going to involve you. And so what I'm going to do is ask someone to read. I say read out, and that's a term that I use. It's happening here in this print. First, what's your name?
Ray.
Ray?
It's like the woman drowning when the baby's drowned.
Exactly. And this print, for instance, of a woman she's gasping for air. She can no longer save her child, so the child is dead. focuses on the women and children in the war who suffered as much, if not more, than the soldiers themselves. And a lot of the focus on the art at the time was on soldiers in the trenches, not on the villagers, for instance. He didn't hesitate, you know, to involve fantasy, as in this case, I mean reality as in this case, where a soldier's guts are being spewed out on the ground. Nor does he hesitate here. Paulette, you want to read this out?
Well, I look at it as futility, but because it's people who are, they have a, you know, it's like the ambulance, but the
Stretcher.
people, the stretcher that they have is their heads are cut off and they're on the stretcher, but they're still moving forward in space.
Right.
So it's sort of the futility of war, or the abomination that you see and you still have to keep going.
Right.
That's the way I read it. But
Yeah. And actually, how do you know that they're soldiers?
Sword, cross.
Yeah, and their uniforms.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another indication, especially with wordless novels.
Yeah, it shows up there.
Yeah, is that you look at everything that you can, the costume that they're wearing, even sometimes the clothes, like here you don't see with his shirt any buttons, you know. So that's another indication.
So
Yep.
that would be more of a civilian then?
Yes, yeah.
So if you're saying that he cataloged the entire century, did he do some uplifting and cheery things too? Because it wasn't all war.
Absolutely not. No. I would say the majority, like 90%, is really focused on social injustice and anti-war. His work was fairly bleak, but there was also a section, which is why I pointed to this print here, is that he opens up here this whole realm of the fantasy and the surreal,
Yeah.
and he did this in a book called The Idea, or The Idea. In that book, the artist is trying to find an idea, and he has his head like on the table. It's noted in one of the books over there. And this woman comes out of his head, and what he does, she represents an idea, and he puts her in an envelope and sends her out into the world. And she, of course, they don't know what to do with her. She's naked too, which causes a little stir. But the whole idea of the idea was that how we accept readily, some of us, mostly artists, for instance, accept new ideas, and the bourgeois in this novel, for instance, are afraid of new ideas, and so they try to clothe her, they try to put her in prison, and just to end that story is that she eventually comes back to the artist's home, and he has another idea that's popped out of his head. So he takes the original idea and places her on the wall. But he uses a lot of his fantasy to not only explore different feelings and emotions, and that's not as heavy as some of his anti-war books. The one thing too about Mazaril was that, like this portfolio and his first couple books, he printed himself. There weren't any publishers who were backing his work at all. And then Kurt Wolff, who was a German publisher, came along and first saw what's referred to as a passionate journey. And he was so taken by this work that he published it. And what he was a very entrepreneur, and what he did in order to sell these wordless books is that he had an introduction by a noted writer like Thomas Mann or Hermann Hesse. And so the public was well acquainted with their literature. So they picked these books up, and once they picked them up and read out these wordless stories, they were taken by him. This Passionate Journey, that was Mazaril's second book, sold over 100,000 copies in Europe. And Mazaril was like a household name. He was recognized not as the gallery artist, but he was more noted for the every woman, man, you know, the every man is the phrase, type of artist. And Kurt Wolff actually, in the books like The Idea or Passionate Journey, Mein Studienbronk is the German title, is that he published those in this format, and there's a copy of it, which, if you look at this, it was originally called My Book of Hours, and those who are familiar with the actual Christian Book of Hours, is that it used to tell you, like, every day what prayer to say and what time to say the prayer, and they were usually portrayed in some type of illuminated means. But what Kurt wanted to do with this was to have it small enough so that you could stick it in your pocket if you were wearing that shirt, or your pants pocket, or, you know, in front of you. Has anyone read Passionate Journey? There's copies of it over here, and it really is a book of what a 20th century man, how he came of age, and he goes through every adult experience, whether it's sexual, loneliness. There's pictures of him just in the woods reading. Like, remember the first time that you picked up a book that actually spoke to you? I remember for myself when I first read Catcher in the Rye, it was, oh my God, I finally found someone who speaks directly to me. And that's pretty much how I feel about Mazriel's work.
Were they limited editions?
These weren't. These were like the ones published by Wolff, so there were thousands and thousands.
And they were printed from the actual wood blocks?
No, those weren't. What they used was electrotype. You know, so they would take the wood cut and put it in hot wax, and then pour metal into the wax in order to get the actual plate. Yeah. Also, this book was banned in the United States, and there was an edition of 600 copies that they said, oh, we'll send 600 copies to the United States and see how they like it. And there's some really interesting wood prints in this book, you know, and some of the ones that didn't get past the censors, you know, in the States. But during World War I, a lot of the soldiers picked this book up, you know, and brought it back to the States. So it was Mazriel's name was not recognized quite as much as it was in Europe, which led to Lynd Ward, who was the first American woodcut artist. He from 29 to 37. This was recognized as the first woodcut novel in the United States. But Ward later said, you know, I'm not the first. You know, he had Mazriel over here, and we'll see when we go over in this direction, another woodcut artist called Otto Nugel, who actually used lead instead of wood for his books. But Ward was, his father was the first chairman of the American Civil Liberties Union. He was a Methodist minister. Ward Lynd was born and raised in a very religious environment, but also a very social conscious environment. His books, like Mazriel, they're not as stark as Mazriel's, but they certainly point to the social injustice, especially during the Depressions. This large print that we blew up over here is from his last book called Vertigo, which is over 200 wood engravings. And I feel there's copies of it over there. I feel that this book displays the American Depression better than any textual book, including Grapes of Wrath, you name it. Waiting for Nothing by Thomas Cromer, which I think is another highly regarded textual story about the Depression, but nothing competes to Ward's picture book. Ward was also noted as a children's book illustrator. He won 2 Newbery Awards and also did do you remember the landmark books like Johnny Tremaine? He was the illustrator for those books. And he also, toward the end of his life, he created a wordless children's book done in gouache, and it's called Silver Pony. It's still in print today, and it focuses on a boy's relationship with his father, but also his relationship with what is real and what is fantasy. So he has to come to terms with the fantasy and reality in his life. So, briefly, before we get into the contemporary artists and then jump back to Roger Bach, is that why did I get interested in this? And I always go back to when I was a child. My father, before we went to bed, my brother and my father would come up, and we had double beds, and Dad would come up with his chair, and he would read us a book, like a chapter in a book. And then we had a nice little library of picture books, and then he would say, like one night it would be my brother, the next night it would be me, and he would say, "Now you read me a story." And I would go over and pick up a wordless picture book and read out the story to him. And there was a couple books that I just loved, but my story changed depending on what I did that day. And the thing that I recognized was that my father was a very stern man, but and whenever I read out to him my story from the book, he never said, "That's not right," or that's wrong. He never scolded me about how I interpreted the story. He always said, "That's fascinating," And so for me, it gave me a sense of self-esteem. It made me proud, I remember. And my brother and I even got in fights after Dad left because my story was always better than my brother's. So briefly, I was always interested in comics. I fell out of a tree when I was 8 and was in a brace for like 3 years. So I couldn't play around like the other kids, but we lived out in the country, and there was always like a bookmobile in the summer that came along, so I could get those wordless picture books, and but also comic books. When I went to graduate school, the professor, Estelle Jessam, who was a noted scholar in photography, gave an assignment. She said, "I want you to compare a book like Rockwell Kent's Moby Dick to something." Well, I chose the classic illustrated Moby Dick, the comic. And she read my paper and then said, "Oh, are you interested in comic books?" And I proudly said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, are there any specific ones?" And I said, "I've always been interested in wordless, in Mad Magazine, I remember used to have little wordless marginals, and there was Aragonés always used to have some wordless strips in Mad. And so I mentioned those, and she said, "Anything a little bit more serious?" and I said, "Yeah, Franz Mazariel, I remember seeing in the Passionate Journey when I was an undergraduate, and Lynn Ward, that was the one there, Madman's Drum." And she said, "Oh," and she said, "Let's talk tomorrow." Well, that night she did, as any scholar would, looked up anything she could find about this material, and she came back the next day and she said, "There's no one doing any work on this." She said, "That's what you need to do. There's a whole avenue of research open for you to do this." And that's what I've been doing. So that's that.
You take advice very well.
Yeah, my father made sure of that. Well, let's go over this in this direction. Construct canons and So he used that. This book is very interesting. It focuses on the trials of a woman trying to etch out a living in Europe at the time, and you were either married or in servitude or a prostitute. And she actually goes through all states. That's I wouldn't recommend it to you. It's a very bleak book. She's killed in the end. She has to drown a child that she can't care for. But it brought to the attention of a very literate public the power of picture books. And I used to find this. No one was looking at this stuff 30 years ago. And I used to go to antiquarian bookstores, and I never said, where's your illustrated books? I always said, where's your children's books? Because every time a dealer would open one of these books, he or she wouldn't see any words, just pictures, children's books, And so that's where I would find them.
What's the title of that book again? Sorry?
It's called Destiny, by Otto Nugel. And Dover actually has a edition out.
When you said it was done in lead,
Yeah.
you carved the lead?
A wood cut, which is what Mazaril does, is on the plank of the wood. So you take the plank and you etch out in the wood, and it's always in reverse because you're inking it and then putting a piece of paper and then pulling the print. The engravings, like what Lynn Ward did and Neil Boschfield and Roger Buck, is on the end grain, and it's usually a hardwood. So the end grain this way. So you're able to use a lot more tools to get a more fine line. So, and then lead obviously is lead, a block of lead, that's what he used. So he uses his tools to scrape the lead, which is soft, like
I mean,
palm.
it's really fine. It's
Yeah.
like that one in engraving.
Yeah, it is. It's very similar to an engraving. Yeah. There's an example of an engraving. And it's usually like really hard wood. This is from Roger Buck. This is Brian Corbley, his grandson, Roger's grandson, and Lena, his wife, over here. So, and Neil, we'll see, Neil Boschfield did the same.
So why wouldn't you call this an engraving?
You would. Yeah. The term, by the way, is that a novel in woodcuts, even though lead cut, wood engraving, lino cut, which is this stuff, it's still like under the umbrella of woodcut or a novel in woodcut. The contemporary artists started basically because of George Walker, who we'll see in a second over in this corner. But these over here were his students, and we'll start with this one right here, Marta Chikalinska, who's a Polish immigrant, as he was working with the boys, came out. And what he wanted to do was to create a woodcut novel based on the lives of this one family. A father who spends probably more time at the tavern than at home, a wife who's pretty alienated and isolated and also addicted, and their two boys who find work, in a small factory, but also the economy is changing as it is today. The manufacturing jobs are no longer available in the story. So not only is the father trapped as we see him, you see the imagery of the spider web in the background. Not only is the father trapped, but also his sons no longer have an opportunity to work. There's also some prints over in back of the books there that I would really recommend that you take a look at. Neil's fine line is exceptional. His engravings are, as far as I'm concerned, are top notch.
One of the burial scene has so much detail.
Yeah, it is, and I'll get to that in just a second, which is his second book. But here what happens is that a tragedy happens with the two brothers and a group in their gang, and one of their friends falls to his death as they're trying to escape from a robbery. And one of the boys, it changes his life, so he seeks, another way out where his brother doesn't. But what Neil was doing was really portraying what Ward and Mazaril had done earlier, is to really focus on today's social injustice and the narrow hope that our kids have, in this economy, not only here in the States, but also in Europe and England. So Neil's I had an opportunity to go visit him and his wife Claire this last summer. Every artist that I know, they have their own cataloging system, for their works. And Neil's no exception. And in this one room with all these hundreds of engravings, if I asked for an example of something, he knew exactly where to go. And he has a way of numbering, and as a librarian, I love that. So his second book that he's working on, he figures the title is Alfred Brown. This one's Walking Shallows, by the way. Alfred Brown, he figures will be done probably in about 7 years, because he projects that it's going to be close to 900 wood engravings. Now, anyone who has done an engraving knows it takes all day to do one, and Ward used to spend days, on his engravings. And just like Ward and most of the artists here, is that if something was not quite right, like I remember one of Ward's daughters saying that a petal on a flower wasn't quite what Lind wanted it to be, so the block that they spent hours on, he just tossed aside. This is the beginning of what Neil describes as kind of a semi-autobiographical work. This is the actual size of the engravings that he's working on. They're not shrunk or blown up at all. I think I have him convinced to maybe try to get this one published in 200 engravings and have like a 4-book series, so that at least he could find some financial support during this time. These, like you observed, what's your first name? What's your first name?
Alexandra.
Alexandra. As Alexandra mentioned, is the lines are so fine you can compare them to even Ward's work that you see over here, and also, as you mentioned, with Mughals, fine line. This is something to watch. If we go. He's illustrated, a dozen books with his engravings. He's also, this last book that he's done here is a book of hours, and it's actually a tribute to Mazaril's Book of Hours, just the title alone, saying that he's following in the path of Mazaril. But rather than focusing on the life of a man and every man of the early 20th century, what George did here was that prior to 9/11, he took the lives of numerous people in New York and just followed them around. So there's like little snapshots. That actually looks very much like George. Pouring coffee. We have someone cleaning the floor, 2 lovers, walking in the rain, a street scene, a woman kind of hauntingly looking at a computer screen, and then someone else looking at their laptop. All these lives come together, and there's no indication until the very last page what's actually happening, after all these people are coming together. And there's there's a quote by George that I want to read you that's presents the spirit of this book, which is a highly powerful book with images that aren't really connected until you get to the end and you see the interconnectedness of everyone. What George says is, quote, "The text is called the Book of Hours because it is largely and also paradoxically an exploration, condemnation, and celebration of our culture's devotion to time and the way our regimental routines can both reassure and also strangle us in tumultuous times. In the 15th century, a Book of Hours told the devoted when to pray and what to say in their prayers. But today, our Book of Hours is unwritten, and it is made up of our daily routine of work and play. Many of us, like the people in this book, follow the prescribed 8 hours of work with weekends off. We make our way through the hours of the day without expecting the routine to divert from its path, without really knowing such diversion is even possible." And obviously, end of quote, but obviously, you'd never know what could happen in the next moment. So. George also just finished, please go right around here. George also did blocks. What I like about what George does here is that he ran a limited edition from the blocks in a small edition, which he opens for a lot of like special collections at university libraries. Plymouth State University has a copy if you want to visit sometime. And then what he does is that then he works and puts it out in a trade edition. And I really think that that's the way to go today. You keep the craft alive. You have the artists, he or she, pulling the prints from the blocks that they spent hours on. You have that as all the artists who I've spoken to attest to. There's that relationship between them, their hands, and their work. It's pretty similar to Buddy Bolton and his music, his trumpet. Anyone who works with their hands over hours and hours and hours, there's that relationship, and I think that's what's really important here, to keep that craft alive. So he's able to keep the craft alive at a reasonable price. I believe this edition was like $1,500 for the copy, but it also allows libraries like mine and the special collections like at Columbia and other places to keep those available. What I use them at Plymouth for is that I bring in the graphic art students, and we're able to open them up and let them see, what an actual print looks like, with the embossing and everything involved. So, and then there's the trade edition, which is more reasonably priced for the public. So why don't we move out toward the way that you came in, and where this book came out, and I received an email from Brian and Lena, and they were saying, I see you're going to be at Columbia, I have something I want to show you. Looks like maybe my grandfather may have done something like what your book talks about. And so I went there, and I met Brian, and Brian brought a copy of Baraka, which is right over here. And I'll briefly talk about this because Brian can speak more about this than I. What I noticed immediately is the skill of these engravings. Now, this was never published. This has been in a trunk for 60 years. So when he showed me this, I was, to put it mildly, I can say this, blown away. And I said, oh my God, this is unbelievable. To find this. this book. And then Lena and Brian invited me over to their home, where I was able to see a lot more of Roger's work. And not only his diary, but he did some book illustrations for this book, Gray Shadows. But a lot of other prints like these. And as you'll see, his skill is equal to not only Neil Boschfield's, but also Lynn Ward. His style is not as socially focused, except maybe in my diary, but it has something that all the others don't. And it's kind of this, what I call romantic symbolism, very strong symbolism. In fact, I found Baraka difficult to read through and get a gist of what was going on immediately. That I had to go back, pretty much like Madman's Drum, Ward did, and really look more closely at how Buck has the narrative portrayed. But it's a love story with evil Baraka getting into the mind of the male character and how that can destroy a relationship. We're close to getting some of this stuff published after a couple of years, and I think once people see the quality and the caliber of this work, it's going to be. I think it's not going to be. It is monumental. It just needs to be placed in the public's hands. So I'm really excited about this work. And what I think I'm going to do is. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Brian and Lena are going to be here if you have more questions, especially about Roger's work. Please, check with them. I'm going to be here a while. There's prints over there if you're interested. I would strongly suggest you take a look at some of Neil's work, and the Dover editions of the woodcut novels I wrote most of the introductions for. I'm happy to sign those, and there's a few copies of my book left over there, and I'm happy to inscribe those if you want to do that. So I'll sit over there. Brian and Lena are here. Please make yourselves at home. It looks like there's still a little bit more wine left, so.